Hello, friends, and welcome to the February 1st edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Outreach Director, and today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And joining us today will be Jessica Shortall with Texas Competes, talking about non-discrimination and gender-based discrimination legislation. We'll have Josh Houston with our legislative update of the week. But first, to help us put a theological frame on the conversation, I'm excited to welcome my friend and Texas Impact board member, Rabbi Neil Blumoff with Congregation Agudas Achim of Austin for this week's Weekly Word. Rabbi Blumoff, we are glad to have you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Scott, and it's an honor to be here and a privilege to work with the good work that Texas Impact does. And as we speak about the power of coalition and teamwork, this spirit of collaboration is tailor-made for Texas. We should take a maximalist position on who is welcome to do business in our state. Those in government service should take heed and build upon the recent Supreme Court decision that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects employees from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So many now are streaming to Texas to look for expansive ways to conduct business and to live a life that rewards ingenuity, generosity, and compassion. In the coming days and years, tourism, a search for talent, and corporate investment will continue to be premiums in our state. All Texans can meet this challenge and offer our way of life free from discrimination as a benefit in uplifting the economic standards for all of us. Religious organizations can be leaders in this work. Rather than think of defining holiness and human life so narrowly, we have the great responsibility to teach, lead, and model how the image of God emanates within all of us. We are to set the table for all of our neighbors to compete freely in the workplace. In our histories, certainly in mine, we have seen where state restrictions, boycotts, and discrimination leads to dehumanization and a numbness to consider how we are all God's children and how we are all in relationship to each other. Let us lean on decency and not on fear. Let us summon our aspirations and not settle for the low bar of suspicion and rancor. Like those in our biblical tradition, like Aaron, the brother of Moses, we are to stand in the breach in a time of urgency to stop the twin plagues of grievance and disdain. We have seen in this past year how sickness does not know a border. Let us invite all to work together for our mutual betterment and advantage. And at a cellular level, we know that we were once strangers in a strange land. Today, let us open our hands of generosity. In the spirit of abundance, let us see each other in our diversity and together working for non-discrimination. Walking forward, let us offer blessings for each other and to our advancement. Each of us a steady beacon of renewing possibility, and our great state of Texas a light unto our nation. Amen.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi Blumoff. Took me a second to get my video back on. Next, we would like to welcome to the conversation our featured guest for today, Jessica Shortall, who leads Texas Competes, a 6-year-old coalition of nearly 1,500 Texas employers making the business case for the state to be welcoming to LGBTQ people. She also leads a similar national coalition, America Competes, that looks across state legislatures and to Congress on pressing issues of discrimination and non-discrimination, and that impact LGBTQ people and their employers. So Jessica, we welcome you to the conversation. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I feel like Rabbi Blumoff kind of set you up perfectly for today, so I really appreciated that reflection.
You kind of took my job, Rabbi.
So Jessica, I like to start out with a positive, right? So non-discrimination is an important part of Texas Impact's legislative agenda. In 2017, as you probably know, we were deeply involved in the work to defeat the discriminatory bathroom bill. But this session, there is legislation that mainstream faith communities and groups like Texas Competes are supporting. And so, again, like to start with the good news first. What legislation do you hope Texans of faith will follow to help promote equality?
Yeah, well, we know that, for example, comprehensive inclusive non-discrimination bill will be filed. Representative Jessica Gonzalez from Dallas has talked about it quite a bit last year and into this year. We've seen legislation like that filed every session, but Representative Gonzalez will be filing what will be, I believe, a bipartisan joint authored bill that will extend non-discrimination protections in employment and housing to LGBTQ people and veterans, and that will add public accommodations protections for everyone in Texas, since that law doesn't exist in Texas. So certainly that's exciting, because at its heart, non-discrimination is about a couple things. Most importantly, I think shared values, that everyone belongs and everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, that we all have of course, a fundamental right to believe what we believe, but that treating each other with dignity is also essential. And then secondary to that, the idea that everyone should have the same opportunity to work hard and to, earn a living, put a roof over their family's head, and participate fully in their community. So certainly, a bill that would say that in employment and in housing and in going about the daily life in the community, LGBTQ people and veterans, like I said, should be welcome and not discriminated against for who they are, is exciting. And we know that there's a really strong business case behind that type of policy as well.
So appreciate that. We know that not everything this legislative session is going to be positive. I think it's safe to assume, especially given the news over the course of the last week, that some Texas leaders will promote harmful, discriminatory legislation. And again, we certainly saw some signals on that last week. What do we need to be ready to stand up against? What's the current climate, and what should we be watching for?
Yeah, so, I've been doing this work for 6 years and have been followed kind of very clear waves of discriminatory legislation that get filed in state legislatures. They tend to follow pretty closely coordinated patterns across states. So as you mentioned, in 2016 and 17, state legislatures were in the bathroom wars, right? Unnecessary and misleading legislation about where people can use the restroom in public. We saw, of course, a huge outcry on that from faith communities, law enforcement, teachers, families, and, in my world, the business community in Texas. So we are seeing a reboot or attempt at a reboot of that type of legislation in two ways. So kind of a repackaging of the misinformation and unfounded fears about who transgender people are, but with a much tighter focus on transgender children. So specifically, we never know in February of an odd numbered year what legislation will really fly in Texas, but we know that we've seen bills filed that would bar transgender children from playing youth sports. And that legislation would also open any child up to being accused of not belonging and being humiliated and having to prove their sex to schools or coaches, what have you. And then we have seen legislation filed in Texas as well as in other states that would criminalize healthcare and mislead folks about what healthcare looks like for transgender youth. So those two categories we're watching very carefully. And then we will likely see, as we see every session in Texas, legislation filed, and we've already seen some, that is in the kind of license to discriminate category that gets framed up as religious exemption. So we just saw a bill filed, I think, last week that would allow any healthcare provider to refuse care to anyone based on that individual's religious beliefs. So that could include life-saving care, and that could be care to anybody, based on their faith, based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, or for any other reason. So we'll be following all of those very carefully.
So we have heard Texas faith leaders, talk about some of the moral reasoning that they oppose discriminatory legislation. But as somebody who works with the business community, what are some other arguments against these discriminatory bills?
Hang on, I got to shoo my husband away. I'm on a podcast. I can't talk to you. It wasn't one of my children coming in this time.
We've all been there. My 5-year-old has appeared on Weekly Witness multiple times.
Right, 5, 41. It just, it varies.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to say the question again because I've lost my train of thought entirely.
Yeah, so we've heard faith leaders talk about these bills from a moral perspective, and
yes, okay, thank you. I mean, what's interesting about this is that for the business folks, the heart of the whole thing is values-based as well, right? Like they wouldn't be weighing in on discriminatory legislation if it didn't harm people, because it's the harm to, in this case, children, and that was partly true for the bathroom bills too. The harm is what creates the downstream business and economic impacts, negative impacts. So, in the tourism context, for example, those harms, Texas lost $66 million in canceled tourism business in 2017. That was without a bathroom bill even passing. That was just folks heading for the hills, meetings and conventions because it was too uncertain of an environment, and they wanted to go somewhere where they knew that they wouldn't run into issues and where their attendees wouldn't be made to feel unsafe. If we had passed a bathroom bill that year, there was 1.4 billion with a B dollars worth of meetings and conventions that were poised to cancel in Texas. So, those things happen because of harm. They're not divorced from each other. It is either the perception that vulnerable people are being targeted and harmed that make attendees want to cancel, speakers, sponsors, that's on the tourism space. And on the, kind of broader business side, it's a talent thing, right? We know that 83% of Americans, I think it's 70% of Texans now, support non-discrimination for LGBTQ people. So you think about that when you're trying to attract in a war for highly educated knowledge workers, folks will vote with their feet.
Right.
And if most Americans support non-discrimination, that also means that some folks are going to balk at the idea of putting down roots in a place where either they or their family members might be unsafe, or even if they don't have a family member where they feel like harm is being done to vulnerable people. So it's really it's connected back to that values and morality question anyway. It's just that it also has bottom line effects. I think we've seen business folks over the years in Texas and elsewhere really eloquently weave those two things together and go, yes, it's a bottom line issue, but we also actually genuinely care about our people and don't want them to come to harm.
Right.
And they don't live at the office. So, they and their families participate in their communities every day and deserve to feel safe.
So that 70% number is impressive. So pretty significant coalition that is opposing discriminatory bills, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So our folks, and we have legislative engagement group members throughout the state who are working on having conversations with their elected officials. What's the messaging that you would recommend at this point in the session if they were to meet with their elected officials on this topic?
I think, writ large, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I don't know if anyone has mentioned that lately, but
right.
This is something that is harming literally everyone in some way or another, right? So of course the very real human toll and loss of life, which is, everyone I know now has been affected in one way or another, as well as the health effects, including, people who are, long-term ill, the social isolation that's happening, and then the economic effects, that are tied into the public health crisis. So we have an emergency in front of us that is affecting everyone and that deserves attention. What we know from experience is that pursuing divisive policies that target vulnerable people tends to suck all the air out of the room, and things that need attention don't get all of the attention, or sometimes any of the attention that they deserve. we've got to have solutions that have everybody working together. And these kinds of things can absolutely take up all of the space or much of the space. And we can't afford any of that right now. So, I mean, that's like kind of the baseline message is, can we please focus on the real crisis? We know that the bathroom thing in 2017 was manufactured. In fact, some of the activist groups publicly said so later, that they concocted what they called the bathroom predator myth. And so, if we're facing another round of kind of quote unquote emergencies that aren't emergencies, that's going to be at the expense of the actual emergency we're all facing together. So that's kind of number one. And I think too, when talking to folks, understand that a lot of people don't know or don't think they know who trans folks are. And that was certainly true for me 6 years ago. And sometimes that lack of knowledge gets filled with fear by other people and messages. And so just to have some empathy for that, if you're in a place like me of privilege, I'm a cisgender person, to be able to kind of like create a little space for empathy there and, share stories with permission, but not come at it. Understand that there's always space for growth and learning and a journey for folks. And sometimes modeling that journey ourselves can be really powerful. Explaining how we ourselves, I myself, have learned and made mistakes and, gotten to know folks and how that's changed my perspective. I think that can be really powerful.
And maybe I'll say it so you don't have to. I also think it's important, especially for Texans of faith, to identify as people of faith and having those conversations. I think Josh would say one of the lessons we learned in 2017 is that many members had talked about, high profile people of faith coming to their office and lobbying for some of this discriminatory legislation. And so it was important for them to be able to say that they had people of faith who were for equality, who were visiting with them as well. Is that? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, there is this false binary, but it has been very successfully disseminated that somehow, faith and LGBTQ identities or support of those identities are at odds. And they aren't, right? We know that many faith traditions are affirming of LGBTQ people, and many LGBTQ people are people of faith themselves. Like I said, I'm cisgender and straight. I am a person of faith and wildly affirming of LGBTQ people as my siblings. And so, yeah, certainly breaking through that kind of false binary, I think is really helpful, and sharing how faith, that's not my lane. I talk about business all day, but I'm also a person, and I happen to be a person of faith. And it is my faith that informs at the very core my, kind of values and passion about the issue.
I'll give you a chance to close us out on this section. Anything you'd like to shamelessly plug, or anything you'd like to leave us with today?
Yeah, I would love to shamelessly plug. So I'm sure, people listening and watching, maybe small business owners, know someone who owns a small business, all the way down to one person business. Texas Competes is free to join at texascompetes.org. And then we keep folks educated and informed throughout the session and through the off season on everything going on in LGBTQ rights in Texas and how it intersects with business, big and small business interests, how to talk about it, how to understand what's happening, how to talk to lawmakers and friends and family and what have you. So texascompetes.org, we would love to have y'all, and it's completely free to join. So that's my shameless plug.
All right. We really appreciate the time today, Jessica, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation over the course of the session. If there's anything you can think of that we can get out to our folks, please feel free to share that information with us.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the work y'all do.
All right. Appreciate it.
Sorry, I'm being asked to say the organization name slower. Can I do that real quick?
Oh, absolutely.
It is texascompetes.org. So it's all about being, economically competitive. Texas Competes.
And I will post that in the chat momentarily once Josh starts talking. So
thanks, y'all.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the time. All right. Josh, welcome to the conversation. I missed you in this format last week, so maybe we should spend twice as much time chatting today. That was a joke. So Josh, the Texas legislature is starting to form, and we're still in that beginning process, but we're starting to see things slowly come together. We'll talk about the state of the state momentarily, but what are you seeing in terms of the legislature so far?
Yeah, they met for real briefly I think a day or two last week just to do some really boring housekeeping things. But we've had the Senate already appoint committees, and they have begun to get those. A couple of those committees are up and running. The budget process is underway, which is normal on the legislative cycle, and the redistricting committee is also underway, which is also normal for a redistricting year. And we'll know about the House. Speaker Phelan has announced that the House will appoint committees almost certainly sometime this week. And when that happens, those of us that kind of watch the Pink Dome will be looking at those committees and how they're structured and who sits on them, and we'll know, have a lot better idea of what's viable and what the tenor of the session is likely to be.
So one of the things that is moving already is the redistricting process. Do you want to give us a quick update on that and what folks can do?
Yeah, so every 10 years they have to draw new districts. It is especially challenging in a place like Texas, where it is a vibrant and moving workforce. Places are growing, other places are losing population. They're off to a little bit of a fast start over in the Senate, but then you could also argue that they didn't get they weren't able to do the normal work that they're usually able to do in the interim on redistricting because of the pandemic. So nevertheless, the thing to know is that is underway. They have dates set. They're going to have 12 hearings. 11 of them, I believe, are by region, and then one for the entire state. That's going to be over the next couple of weeks. They are all virtual, which is quite notable. There is no in-person hearings. The chair of redistricting, Madam Chair, Senator John Huffman, decided to do them entirely virtual. And that's fascinating because it shows that the legislature is capable of doing virtual meetings. So that is a thing to note. With redistricting specifically, the rural areas are going to be losing population. The urban areas have gained it. Are the districts all that significantly different? Given that it's already the Republican Party is empowered, and with gerrymandering, how many more Republican districts could they actually draw? As it really just more of a realignment of what exists? Wait and see. And part of the reason we have to wait and see is because the timing of the federal government getting the census to us, to the states, to do redistricting is still up in the air and looking like it's going to be delayed, which means we're looking at a special session, and some of the procedures and laws are being debated as we speak about how to best go about fulfilling the obligations of the Texas Constitution when it's the federal government that's gotten us the information late. So all that's kind of going on in redistricting.
So I'm telling Shannon we're not making summer plans quite yet, right?
Yeah, I would not count on it. And that also was kind of leading into a question about what will the workflow of the legislature be in a pandemic, since they have to come back for special session anyway. That's one of the things being talked about and debated as people are taking a real wait and see approach to this session.
So, Josh, I have fond memories of us watching the State of the State together. Once we did it in the Capitol because we had an event. It's certainly going to be different this year, but the governor's State of the State address is tonight. What will you be watching for, and what should we be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, the most notable thing is that it's happening tonight. It usually occurs around the lunch hour when people are at work, and it's usually an address directly to both chambers, the House and the Senate, and they assemble over in the House chamber and do the State of the State at noon. So it's not usually, it is broadcast, but everyone's at work, so it's not widely broadcast. That's the big difference. I mean, this is almost sort of like a State of the Union that occurs nationally. The governor is, in fact, I just got an email about 15 minutes before we started recording this podcast, where the governor's office or the governor has sent an email out to say on what stations in your local area it's going to be broadcast at 7 o'clock. So it's a real opportunity, even though the governor's well known with name identification compared to other elected officials in the state, a lot of people haven't sat down and listened to a governor speak the way you might, other than just in sound bites and what you see on the news and in campaign ads. So it's really an interesting and I don't know how unique, but it's an interesting opportunity to hear the governor of your state talk for people, because it's during prime time on broadcast television. Well, I think so what I'm watching for, and other than the timing of it, which is notable, the question is, so under the Texas Constitution, a lot of folks probably don't know this, the legislature cannot take up any bills and pass them for the first 60 days. And the purpose of that constitutionally is to dedicate that first 60 days to bill filing. That's why it's pretty slow this time of the session, at least to the public anyway. It's relatively slow, and then it picks up in the spring. But there's always an exception to a rule, and the exception is if the governor names something to be an emergency item, then that enables the legislature to take up the item right away. The legislature doesn't have to. There are a number of emergency items that the legislature just says, we're a co-equal branch of government and we'll move at our own pace. Thank you very much. And that's the way the separation of powers works. In this session, what's particularly notable about it is that it's not the governor who's been vaccinated who has to be in the Capitol to pass legislation. And so if the governor names a bunch of emergency items and demands the legislature gets to work, how is that received by the members of the legislature who are at risk and having to be there in person? That's an interesting relational thing to watch. If there are emergency items, then the question is, so the first question is, will there be? Let's see. And if there are, what are they? What they are, if there are any, will be a window into the governor's thinking. It's a very uncertain time politically. I don't think I have to convince anybody of that fact. What's likely to be on there? We know what the governor ran on in November, although he wasn't up for election, what he campaigned on behalf of his party for. How does he approach, whether it's an emergency item or not, how does he approach the issue of policing and racial justice? And notice I said policing and racial justice because I did that intentionally because I think there's a false dichotomy that's possible. Have your ear attuned for this because it gets framed as policing or racial justice, which is a false dichotomy. It is not an either or, it's a both and. And so notice how that rhetoric gets constructed. And then what other items? I mean, you could argue that any number of things are an emergency in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis and all things like that we've seen in the news. What all gets named and what is the framing around, what is the tenor around how those things are discussed?
All right, so anything else that you think we should be paying attention to this week?
No, those are the two big things, House committees and the state of the state. It'll be an interesting preview and window into what the two of the three what we call the big three, the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House, will get a window into what two of those three are thinking. And that'll help shape the tenor and give us clues about how the next few months may go.
So in future weeks, and we've been saying this for a couple of weeks, in future weeks, we'll have a weekly action alert for listeners to use to make telephone calls to their members. What homework assignment do you have for folks this week? My guess is it'll sound a lot like last week's.
Yeah, I mean, normally in the first 60 days, this is the point. This is the time where you can get a legislator's attention. They are awaiting on committees. They're awaiting legislative council to get their bill drafts back so they can file them. Normally, they'd be having meetings with constituents and with interest groups and things of that nature, but at a more leisurely pace. But even that's down and complicated by the pandemic. So it is a time that you can get their attention, because once the committees really start meeting, and then especially as we get into late April and May, they just do not have time. So this is the most ideal time if you have something you deeply care about. This is the time to get it in front of them.
And we'll remember last week, former state rep Sarah Davis talked about the fact that those first 60 days, they want to hear from you. They want the telephone calls. They want the Zoom meetings, so they can understand what their constituents are prioritizing. And if you want to be an effective advocate later in the session, I think we both agree that you need to start that relationship building now if you haven't done that yet.
Yeah, and I should clarify that, you're most likely to be talking to staff, but I bring that up because it's a tense session for staff. I've used to be on staff. I've got, that's who I usually liaison with the most, almost 99% of the time probably, and that's true for any lobbyist. And the staff are really challenged the same way we're all challenged. Many are working from home. Many have children working with them at home. A good number cannot work from home anymore like they could in the summer. They are kind of at the mercy of politics. Yes, that's the job they signed up for, but also having the Capitol open, having people come in and out of the Capitol increases their risk. Many of them have already been exposed and had COVID. A good number that they probably caught at work. They are scared. There's the threat of political violence on top of the disease. So just know that and exercise, whether you're a pastor or not, we're people of faith, so we know this term, exercise your best pastoral care with them. It is a really, really weird and rough session to be on staff.
All right. Any closing thoughts from you today?
That's all.
All right, friends. Well, Josh, thank you for the time. Certainly thankful for Rabbi Blumoff and Jessica joining us today. And thank you all for tuning in. If you have made it this far in the podcast, we hope that you will consider becoming a member of Texas Impact. This work is supported by members like you. And so you can do that by going to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, it has been 18 months that we have been talking about gearing up for this Texas legislative session, as my co-host in the background expressed their enjoyment of the podcast with their barks. There we go. So I'd like to thank you again for tuning in. We have been talking about this for 18 months, and this is important work, and we are thankful for folks like you who are doing this work. If we can support your ministry and your advocacy, please feel free to reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. With all that being said, let's get to work. Thanks, friends.